Hi, everybody. I think Killers of the Flower Moon doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to give it one anyway. Adapted from the true crime bestseller by David Gran, Martin Scorsese's new film for Apple Originals tells the story of a dark chapter in US history. Set in Oklahoma in the 1920s, it uses the unlikely romance between Ernest Burkhart, who's played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and Molly Kyle, who's played by Lily Gladstone, to reveal how members of the oil-rich Osage tribe were targeted by white Americans and murdered for their money. It sparked a major investigation that led to the formation of the FBI. With us, we have the casting directors Ellen Lewis and Renee Haynes, costume designer Jacqueline West, and Osage clothing consultant Julie O'Keefe. So please give them a welcome now. Anywhere you like. So where do we start? So let's start with casting questions. Where do you begin with a movie like Killers of the Flower Moon?
I start with Marty sending a script. I had already read the book of Killers, so I knew the story. And then research information starts coming in from Marianne Bauer, who's one of our producers and an amazing archivist and research person. And there we go. We're off and running. So I'm looking at films from the 1920s, from the Rotary Club, home movies that the Osage had taken, photos of people, different references. And then in this case, I called Renee Haynes very quickly, who is an amazing Indigenous casting director and who I had worked with on Godless, a Netflix show.
So a good time to return to you, Renee. Tell me about your role in the film. Your role in the casting. How did you get involved?
Well, Ellen and I had worked together on another project a few years earlier, and she called me, and of course I immediately said yes. But I specialize in Indigenous casting, have for my entire career. So this was like the ultimate beautiful pinnacle of a
What
project.
was the process? Was it an open audition? How did you find these people?
Many of them I knew already, but first and foremost, we wanted to reach out to the Osage community, to the Osage Nation, and we organized a large open call specifically for the Osage and for the Indigenous community in Oklahoma. We did that in November of 2019, just before the pandemic. And we saw thousands of people showed up, which we could not have done a few months later.
Mm-hmm. That clip was a very good showcase for the costumes. Tell me, please, about researching the period and how you came up with the clothes you used and the clothes you found.
There's a lot of research. Marianne started, even before I came on, sending me beautiful, beautiful pieces of research. She mentioned that the Osage made home movies, but I didn't have access to them. And I got my husband, who's a journalist, started looking up how I could access those. I have a house in Deadwood, South Dakota, and I went to the Carnegie Library. There even is a really good Indigenous library on the Sioux Reserve. And I started just looking at comparing how different the Osage people of this period look from other Plains peoples. And the home movies were the most revealing. I really mind them because the Osage could afford home movies as no one in the world could, except maybe the royal family here in England. It cost $1,800 a minute to make a home movie, but they really documented their life. And I could see how it was part of the sadness for me when you saw how rich their lives were from coming off the plains and buffalo hunting and all of a sudden having this money at their disposal. You could sense their generosity, sharing it all in wedding scenes, with other people. Their richness, one chief described, was not how much money you had, but how much you had to share. Like he gave away 9 Chevrolets at his daughter's wedding. It was a wedding that cost $50 million, which would be $100 million now. the wedding coats were worn in layers, and they were given away to anybody who helped with the wedding. The woman who prepared the food, the roadman's daughter was probably given a coat, beautiful ribbon work blankets. It was all about generosity and giving, but their lifestyles were revealed in these home movies. They had private planes. So when all of it is taken away by the bad guys, by the lawyers and the guardians, it's really, really moving because they weren't ostentatious about their lives. They were really modest for how much money they had, and quite elegant. It wasn't like new rich money. It was spreading it around with your families and giving parties and feeding everyone and helping everyone. It was quite communal. And so I watched a lot of those. I pulled thousands of pieces of research. I divided up, I used the sisters, Molly and her 3 sisters, as a microcosm of how the young people at the time were dressing. And some stayed very traditional, like Molly. And then others, like Anna, went totally modern. So there was traditional, modern, and then stages in between, part traditional, part modern, but almost always the women wore blankets. And I was able to, because of studio photos, call on Pendleton Blanket in Oregon, and they reproduced all of the patterns that they had in their archives from the 20s in the color palettes that they made particularly for the Osage. So the blankets become almost a character in the movie. But what I loved about them is how they wore them, because it really was not just like wearing a mink coat, but it was really like armor almost when they went out. The way she wears her blanket when she goes to meet the guardian is really like armor against evil.
I can bring it. What was your journey with this movie?
So I was the lead Osage clothing consultant, and I worked with Jacqueline in her studio, and really went on set, made sure that the blankets that you saw were put on properly. In my culture, everything that you wear, as far as a blanket or a shawl, or even the men who wear blankets, is for a life event, and it can be an everyday look that going to the bank, because we always wore that for modesty for women. And so when we started working with the sisters and working with Lily, a lot of times I would go to her trailer in the morning, and I would sit down with her, and I would say, okay, because they would have gone to a closed rehearsal, and I'd say, show me what it is, what actions are you taking today in this scene? How are you using your hands? What will you be doing? And so there's a beautiful scene where she has on a shawl and she's getting out of Ernest's taxi. And so she is a quintessential Osage lady, elegant. And so everything that we decided to help put on, and then to make sure that everything was flipped out with the fringe that you saw, was a certain purpose in doing that. And you can kind of go through, and it's sprinkled through the movie, where you can see different life events, or the roadman, that he has a blanket around his waist, and when we're doing something which is a ceremony like that, that's typically how the men wear them. You see Chief Bonnycastle, and he has on a very long, it's called peyote style, and it comes around his neck, and then he's holding it around his waist. You can tell that he's a leader, because that's how he's wearing that blanket. So there's a lot of nuances within our clothing.
There's a question for all of you, really. What kind of director is Martin Scorsese? Is he very hands-on? Is he very demanding? I mean, how authentic is the film?
I think the film is extremely authentic, and it's so interesting watching this clip of the sisters. And I think that it shows a humor and love between the sisters, and you get a sense of what this family is. And there's a chemistry and symmetry of that family. One of the sisters is already failing. Marty's attention to detail, he is the greatest collaborator. I've worked with him for many years now. And it's exciting every single time we start something, it's as if it is the very first time. But I do think that this film particularly is resonating with, I hope, everybody, as its importance of telling us this chapter that's very difficult. But as you said, has moments of humor, but in the most magnificent cinematic language.
Jacqueline, your experience with Marty?
It was wonderful, and he is very collaborative. I showed him everything. I mean, he kind of said, okay, now just do it. You know, I'd read the script. We had some initial conversations. I showed him a few images. It was during COVID. I was at my house in Deadwood, South Dakota, and he was at home in New York. And I think maybe once a week, we'd do a Zoom, and I'd show him kind of where I was at on characters. We talked about old movies that I'd found that I felt were good references for Leo and for Bob, and he agreed, and he said everything I'd shown him, he said, yes, just go for it.
What's the reaction been in the community, in the Osage community? How has it been? Has the film been seen yet? And what was the reaction to the story being told?
So we had a screening for 800 of our tribal members. And, you know, it's a very difficult conversation with each other. We have a hard time talking about it with each other. We still have, you know, relatives that were victims of that. And there were 1,000 deaths that some are undocumented, many are undocumented. And this is just a microcosm of that because it was so over the top. And I would say that there was a really good reception from the community. But I found the most interesting part of this is coming out into different audiences, because when we watched the movie, we heard humor, but there was no one laughing I mean, it was just how we took it in. And then I'm witnessing as I'm going through, and I love a lot of Marty's movies, and I do love his humor in all of them. But I can kind of see how it's being received in the outside world. And, but we were very proud of this movie. And, you know, the other thing is the community really rallied around this. They brought photographs. We're sitting in COVID. Everybody's trying to social distance. Jackie and I organized what was called a trunk show, and people would drive up with their cars and open the back of their trunks. And they would take out photographs and possessions that were of this time period or older to share, because everybody in the community wanted to get this right. And the best part about the bar and the standard that Marty set, because authenticity really is the key word here. And he went into the community and he found language speakers that worked. I mean, Lily really sounds like a fluent speaker who's Osage, even though she's Blackfeet. But I do think overall that really nailed down and cemented the authentic part of Osages. And we really, when we looked at it, we really do see ourselves.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you very much. Up next, we have Antonia Blythe and the Apple original film, Fingernails. But please thank the panel.